He was a veteran Navy SEAL who came to the northern forest to disappear. But beyond his cabin stood an old concrete structure on the ridge, abandoned, silent, and watching. Every night, his German Shepherd faced that building, sensing something beneath the earth no one else could feel. What they uncovered wasn't just a forgotten Cold War relic. It was a buried experiment tied to his own past. This time, he wouldn't ignore the warning or the instinct at his side. Where are you watching from today? Like this video, subscribe to The Last Command K9, and stay for the full story. Callan Rhodes arrived in northern Minnesota under a sky too blue to trust. Early summer light spilled across the lake like liquid glass. The pine trees stood tall and unbothered, their dark green needles trembling in a breeze that carried the clean scent of sap and water. Nothing about the place suggested danger. Nothing suggested history. That was precisely why he chose it. Callan was 43. Though the lines at the corners of his eyes and the faint scar near his left brow made him look older when he was quiet, which was most of the time. He stood about 6'1", broad-shouldered but no longer built like a recruiting poster. His strength had compacted over the years into something denser, less visible. His brown hair was cut short, military habit refusing to fade, though streaks of early gray marked his temples. A rough beard framed his jaw, never fully shaved, never fully grown. His eyes were blue-gray, observant and heavy with the habit of measuring rooms for exits. He didn't come to the cabin to rebuild his life. He came to reduce it. The cabin itself was modest. Weathered timber, a narrow porch facing the lake, one stone chimney leaning slightly as if tired. It had belonged to an old widower who'd passed quietly the previous winter. No family, no drama. Callan liked that. Argus approved too. The German Shepherd was 8 years old, black and tan with a thick, disciplined frame. His muzzle had begun to frost silver, though his posture still carried the alert economy of a working K9. A faint scar ran along his left flank, hidden beneath fur, but remembered by both of them. Argus moved through the clearing like a surveyor reclaiming old ground. He sniffed the edges of the porch, circled the lake shore, tested the soil beneath the pine needles. His ears twitched at distant birds, but he did not bark. He never barked without reason. The first few days passed in near silence. Callan fixed a loose hinge, patched a crack in the window frame, stacked firewood even though summer barely required it. He woke before sunrise out of habit. He listened to the forest the way other men listened to traffic. And beneath the ordinary sounds, wind, water, insects, he sensed something missing, or perhaps waiting. It was Argus who noticed it first. Each morning, after a slow lap around the clearing, the dog would stop and stare north. Not at the lake, not at the tree line immediately behind the cabin. Further, toward the ridge. The ridge rose gently beyond a stretch of forest, and on its shoulders stood a structure of pale concrete, angular, utilitarian, abandoned since the late Cold War. Locals called it the old relay station. It had once been part of a geological monitoring network, or so they said. Weather observation, earth movement, nothing dramatic. Callan had seen its silhouette the day he arrived. He had felt something then too, not fear, recognition. 3 days in, he drove into town. The town was small enough that everyone knew when. A new truck appeared on Main Street. The gas station doubled as a grocery and post office. Inside, behind the counter, stood a woman in her mid-40s named Sarah Harlow. Sarah was tall and lean, her posture naturally upright, as if she had once trained in something disciplined. Dance, maybe, or military ROTC. Her dark auburn hair was pulled into a low ponytail, strands escaping in the humidity. Freckles dusted her pale skin. Her eyes were sharp hazel, quick to assess but not unkind. She noticed the way Callan scanned the room before meeting her gaze. "You the new cabin owner?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Just renting," he replied. Her eyes flicked briefly to Argus, who sat calmly at Callan's side, watching without tension. "Dog's well trained," she observed. "He's old," Callan said. Argus shifted slightly, as if offended by the word. Sarah smiled faintly. "Old dogs don't sit like that." She told him the relay station had been shut down decades ago. Budget cuts. No mystery. Just bureaucracy. "Nothing up there but raccoons and cracked concrete," she said. Callan nodded, but his gaze drifted past the window toward the north. Argus did the same. That night, the lake lay perfectly still. Callan sat on the porch, boots resting against the wooden railing. He closed his eyes and let the forest breathe around him. At first, there was nothing unusual. Then, he felt it. Not heard, felt. A faint tremor through the soles of his boots. It was subtle enough that another man might dismiss it as imagination. But Callan had spent years in environments where imagination got people killed. He removed his boots and pressed his palm against the porch floor. There. A low-frequency vibration. Not constant. Pulsed. Argus lifted his head slowly. The dog did not bark. He stood. He walked to the edge of the porch and faced north. His body stiffened, not with aggression, but with focus. Callan's breath slowed. He hadn't felt that sensation in 20 years. Argus stepped off the porch and walked into the clearing, stopping at the precise edge where pine roots began to thicken beneath the soil. He lowered his body slightly, not lying down, not crouching, just bracing. Then he went completely still. Not even the tip of his tail moved. Callan felt a cold realization slide through him. Argus wasn't reacting to a sound. He was reacting to pressure. Something beneath the earth had shifted. And for a fraction of a second, Callan saw sand instead of pine needles. Saw a desert compound instead of a lakeside cabin. Heard the voice of a young engineer arguing about unstable frequencies. He blinked, and Minnesota returned. But the tremor did not stop. He went inside and retrieved an old device from a storage case he hadn't opened in years. A compact ground vibration meter, military issue once, obsolete now. He powered it on. The screen flickered. Numbers climbed slowly, not seismic activity in the traditional sense. Infrasound, artificial. Callan exhaled carefully. "Not here," he muttered under his breath. Argus returned to the porch but refused to lie down. His ears remained angled northward. Callan crouched beside him, running a hand through the coarse fur along his neck. The scar on Argus's flank caught his fingers. Memory surged. 20 years earlier, in a remote desert testing site, Callan had been assigned perimeter security for an experimental geological frequency project. A civilian engineer, young, nervous, insistent, had warned that the amplitude threshold was unstable. Command overruled him. Callan had followed orders. The test proceeded. The ground gave way. One operator died in the collapse. A K-9 was crushed beneath falling debris. Argus survived that deployment. But something in him changed afterward. And something in Callan did too. The vibration beneath the cabin pulsed once more, stronger this time. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound itself. Callan sat back against the porch post and stared toward the ridge. He didn't believe in coincidence. He didn't believe in fate either. But he believed in patterns. And this pattern felt incomplete. Argus finally lay down, though not fully relaxed. His head remained upright, eyes fixed on the tree line. Callan watched him for a long moment. "You felt it before I did," he said quietly. Argus blinked but did not look away from the ridge. The sky above the trees shifted from deep blue to indigo. Crickets began their evening rhythm. The lake resumed its illusion of peace. Callan rose slowly. He was tired of running from places that hummed beneath the surface. He wasn't sure yet what stood on that ridge. But he knew one thing. The relay station was not dead. And whatever had begun beneath the pines had just introduced itself. He would not ignore it again. Not this time. Callan left before sunrise. The sky was pale silver, the kind of quiet morning that made even the lake seem hesitant to ripple. He moved without hurry, but with intention. Boots laced tight, field jacket zipped against the cool northern air. The old vibration meter sat in his pack, wrapped in a canvas pouch that still smelled faintly of dust and oil. Argus walked ahead this time, not bounding, not exploring, working. The German shepherd's gait shifted subtly once they crossed into the denser stretch of pines leading toward the ridge. His head lowered slightly, ears angled forward. Every few steps he paused, not long enough to stop progress, just enough to listen in ways humans could not. Callan watched him closely. Argus was 8, his black and tan coat still thick but threaded with gray along the muzzle. The scar along his left flank, half hidden by fur, had healed years ago. What never healed was the instinct behind it. He had learned to read the earth the way other dogs read scent. The climb toward the ridge wasn't steep, but the soil grew thinner, rock pressing closer to the surface. The abandoned relay station emerged through the trees like a relic misplaced by time. Pale concrete walls stained by rain, steel door half rusted, a long dead antenna leaning sideways against the sky. Up close, it looked less like a mystery and more like bureaucracy petrified. But Callan had learned long ago that what appeared forgotten was often simply unobserved. He circled the structure once before approaching the entrance. The steel door had once been sealed with a heavy padlock. The padlock now hung open, not broken, unlatched. Recently, Argus stopped. His nose hovered inches above the ground. Then he turned his head sharply to the left. Human scent. Callan crouched, fingers brushing the gravel near the threshold. There it was. An impression faint but clear enough. A boot print. Not old. The soil still held its edges. Someone had been here. Not hikers, not teenagers. The pattern was tactical. Vibram sole. Callan's jaw tightened. He stepped inside. The interior air was cooler than outside, carrying the mineral scent of damp concrete. Dust lay thick along the floor except for a narrow path that cut through the center of the room. The windows were cracked, but intact enough to let in long beams of morning light. Against the far wall, beneath what had once been a monitoring console, sat a portable solar inverter unit. Modern, clean, recently installed. It hummed, not loudly, just enough. Argus moved toward it slowly, each step deliberate. He did not bark, he did not growl. He positioned himself between Callan and the equipment without touching it. A shield. Callan pulled the vibration meter from his pack and switched it on. The screen flickered, numbers rising in steady intervals. Infrasound frequency, controlled, patterned, artificial. He exhaled through his nose. "So it isn't dead," he murmured. Behind the solar unit, a cable ran along the floor, disappearing through a narrow gap in the wall where the concrete had been cut cleanly, recent work. Whoever had set this up knew what they were doing. He followed the cable to a reinforced hatch in the floor, locked, but not sealed. Argus sat beside it and looked up, not at Callan, at the hatch, as if waiting for permission. Callan hesitated. He felt that familiar tug inside his chest, not fear exactly, but anticipation sharpened by memory. 20 years ago, he had stood outside another sealed chamber, listening to engineers argue about thresholds and tolerances. He had believed then that responsibility belonged to someone higher in the chain. Now there was no chain, just him. He knelt and pressed his ear against the metal. The vibration was stronger here, rhythmic, intentional. Someone below was running a test cycle. He rose and stepped back. "Not today," he said quietly. They exited the station without opening the hatch. Callan wasn't reckless. Not anymore. On the way down the ridge, they encountered someone halfway along the trail. The man stood beside a dark green utility vehicle parked awkwardly among the trees. He was in his mid-30s, tall and lean, with the posture of someone who spent more time in labs than gyms. His brown hair was too long to be military, but too neat to be careless. Wireframe glasses rested on a narrow nose. His jacket was technical, charcoal gray, branded but unassuming. Hiking boots, clean. He didn't look surprised. "You're not lost?" the man said evenly. Callan studied him in silence. The man extended a hand. "Rowan Mercer." His grip was firm but not dominant. Callan didn't take it. "Callan?" Rowan nodded once, adjusting to the refusal without offense. "You've been up there," Rowan said, glancing toward the relay station. "I've seen worse." Rowan smiled faintly at that. He had the kind of smile that belonged to someone who believed in what he was building. There was no menace in him, only conviction. "It's just monitoring equipment," Rowan explained. "Ground resonance mapping. Early warning for subsurface instability." "For who?" Callan asked. Rowan hesitated. Not long enough to signal deception, but long enough to suggest layers. "For everyone," he said finally. "If it works." Callan noticed the subtle tremor in Rowan's fingers, not fear, excitement. "You're running it above safe amplitude," Callan said. Rowan blinked. "You'd need data to say that." Callan didn't answer. Argus stood between them, silent, watching Rowan's hands rather than his face. Rowan noticed. "He's beautiful," Rowan said softly. "Military?" "Yes." Rowan's eyes shifted, interest sharpening. "I didn't expect company up here," Rowan added. "This area's pretty quiet." "That was the idea," Callan replied. They stood in a silence edged with evaluation. Rowan finally nodded. "If you're worried about safety, I can assure you, this system's been calibrated." "Calibrated doesn't mean harmless," Callan said. Rowan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You ever try to predict a sinkhole before it swallows a town?" Rowan asked quietly. "You ever wish you had better data before something collapses?" The question hung heavier than intended. Callan held his gaze. "Yes." Rowan seemed about to say more, but stopped himself. "Anyway," Rowan said, stepping back toward his vehicle, "it's temporary. Just field trials." Callan watched him drive away. Temporary. He had heard that word before, too. They returned to the cabin near midday. The lake shimmered innocently. Callan set the vibration meter on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. The numbers had stopped fluctuating once they'd left the ridge. Patterned cycles. Controlled. But pushing limits. He stepped outside again, scanning the tree line. Argus moved toward the water's edge and drank briefly before lifting his head, droplets falling from his muzzle. The dog's expression changed. Not alarmed. Alert. He turned not toward the ridge this time, but toward the lake. Callan followed his gaze. Nothing. just sunlight and reflection. Then he saw it. A faint ripple, not wind-driven, moving outward in a circular pattern near the center of the lake. No boat, no fish breach, just a pulse. The surface settled again. Argus remained still, eyes fixed. Callan felt something colder than fear. Connection. The ridge wasn't isolated. The vibration carried further than Rowan realized. Argus stepped forward into the shallows, water rising around his paws. He did not swim. He did not drink again. He lowered his head close to the surface as if listening through it. For a brief second, the lake answered. A low tremor beneath the water, subtle but undeniable. Callan's throat tightened. The system wasn't just mapping the earth. It was interacting with it. And for the first time he understood the scale of what might be happening, not beneath the station, but beneath everything. The ripple vanished. The lake returned to glass. Argus walked back to shore without shaking off the water. Callan sat on the porch steps as afternoon light shifted golden. He replayed the encounter with Rowan in his mind. Rowan hadn't seemed malicious, driven, yes, perhaps desperate. Callan recognized that too. He thought of the engineer from years ago, the one who had warned about unstable thresholds. The young man's name surfaced now. Daniel Kessler. Pale, anxious. Too young for the weight of the room he'd stood in. Daniel had believed in the data. He had just believed the wrong people would use it carefully. Callan had believed the wrong chain of command. He leaned back against the railing, feeling the dull ache in his right shoulder, a souvenir from that same deployment. Not again, he murmured. Argus rested beside him, but not fully relaxed. His body angled slightly toward the lake, ears occasionally twitching. Callan knew what he had to do. Not confront, not accuse, observe, measure, verify. If Rowan was pushing amplitude beyond safety margins, there would be evidence. Data logs, pattern anomalies, thermal signatures. Callan wasn't here to fight ghosts. He was here to prevent repetition. The sun dipped lower, turning the pines copper. For the first time since arriving, Callan did not feel like a man hiding. He felt like a man positioned. The relay station still stood on the ridge, pale and silent in the distance. But now he understood something Rowan might not. When you send a signal into the earth answers. The question was whether anyone down below was listening. Callan intended to. Callan returned to the ridge at dusk. He chose that hour deliberately, not out of secrecy, but precision. At dusk, the forest carried sound differently. Wind softened. Bird song retreated. Subtle mechanical rhythms became easier to isolate from nature's larger symphony. Argus walked at his side rather than ahead this time. The dog's posture was composed, controlled, as if conserving energy for something unknown. The last 2 days had sharpened him. He no longer explored the terrain casually, he scanned it. The relay station loomed pale against the fading sky. The door stood exactly as they had left it. Callan slipped inside without turning on a light. The hum was stronger tonight. Not louder, stronger. There was density to it now, a weight that pressed faintly against his inner ear. Argus moved immediately to the section of floor where the cable disappeared beneath the cut concrete seam. He didn't dig this time. He simply stood over the reinforced hatch and stared. Callan knelt. The lock was still intact. Industrial grade, but field installed. Rowan's team had not intended this to be permanent infrastructure. That meant vulnerability. He took a compact bolt cutter from his pack. The metal gave way with a muted snap. He paused. Not from fear, but from recognition. 20 years ago, he had opened a similar hatch, believing he was securing something. Now he was entering without permission. There was a difference. He lifted the steel door. A narrow ladder descended into dim artificial light. The air rising from below was warmer, carrying the sterile scent of electronics and faint ozone. Argus did not hesitate. He descended first. Callan followed. The underground chamber was smaller than he expected. No grand bunker, just a reinforced concrete cavity retrofitted with modern equipment. Portable server racks hummed in neat alignment. Cables ran overhead in disciplined order. A vibration emission unit stood at the center like a metallic spine. Its casing, matte gray, industrial, unapologetic. On one wall, a digital interface displayed real-time wave propagation models. Lines pulsed outward in radial patterns, mapping subsurface structures in layered transparency. Callan stepped closer. He didn't need to be an engineer to recognize the amplitude indicators creeping above recommended safety margins. Argus circled the room once, nose hovering near the floor. Then he stopped at the base of the emission unit. His posture shifted, not defensive, concerned. Callan studied the interface more carefully. The project title was embedded in the system directory, Project Echo Strata. His breath slowed. He navigated through folders with deliberate restraint. The code-based structure felt familiar, not identical to the desert program, but descended from it. Optimized, civilianized, rebranded. A log file opened. Test cycles, field trials, amplitude escalation phases, then a reference file dated nearly 2 decades ago. An archival transfer. He opened it. Inside were scanned documents from the original military research initiative, partially redacted but recognizable. The naming convention had changed, but the core algorithm remained intact. Callan felt something inside him shift. Not guilt this time, but clarity. The past had not ended. It had been repurposed. A faint click echoed above them. Not mechanical, human. Argus's head snapped toward the ladder. Callan closed the terminal screen instinctively, plunging the room into softer, ambient light. Footsteps approached the hatch, measured, not hurried. The ladder creaked. Rowan Mercer descended slowly, one hand gripping the rail, the other holding a tablet device. He stopped halfway down when he saw them. For a brief moment, surprise overtook his composure. Then it settled into something steadier. "You could have asked," Rowan said evenly. His glasses caught the overhead light. In that glow, his face looked younger than his authority suggested. Idealism sat plainly on him, unhidden, almost stubborn. "You could have told the truth," Callan replied. Rowan stepped fully into the room. He was dressed differently tonight. Field jacket replaced by a dark sweater, sleeves pushed up, revealing forearms inked faintly with geometric line work. His hands were steady, but his jaw tightened slightly. "This isn't what you think," Rowan said. "It's exactly what I think," Callan replied. Rowan glanced at the central emission unit. "We're not destabilizing anything," he said. "We're mapping resonance. Subsurface cavities, water tables, stress points before they become disasters." "You're running amplitude beyond predictive thresholds," Callan said quietly. Rowan hesitated. "Progress requires testing limits." Callan stepped closer to the interface. "Progress killed people once," he said. Rowan's expression flickered. Curiosity mixed with unease. "You were there," Rowan said slowly. Callan didn't answer. Silence settled heavy between them. Argus moved slightly, positioning himself not between the men, but beside Callan. A choice. Without warning, the central unit emitted a sharp, tonal spike. Not loud, but distinct. The interface screen flickered, wave patterns destabilizing briefly before recalibrating. Rowan froze. "That's not scheduled," he whispered. Argus reacted before either man moved. He pressed his body low to the ground, not cowering, not attacking, aligning himself parallel to the emission unit, as if absorbing or bracing against something unseen. Callan felt the air pressure shift. For a split second, the concrete walls trembled, not violently, but enough. Then everything returned to steady hum. The screen stabilized. Rowan stared at the data, confusion overtaking confidence. "That's impossible," he murmured. Callan didn't speak. He simply watched Argus rise slowly, shake once, and fix his gaze on Rowan. Not accusing, not hostile. Questioning. Rowan stepped to the console and pulled up the system log. "There shouldn't have been a spike," he said. "We're operating within modeled constraints." Callan folded his arms. "You're modeling the Earth like it's obedient." Rowan turned sharply. "You think I don't understand risk?" he said, voice tight. "You think I'd run something that could hurt people?" "I think you believe you're in control," Callan replied. The words landed harder than accusation. Rowan looked away. For the first time, doubt flickered across his features. "Field testing is the only way to refine the model," Rowan said more quietly. "If we can predict collapse zones accurately, we save lives. Sinkholes, landslides, infrastructure failures." "And if the model's wrong?" Callan asked. Rowan's silence answered. Callan stepped toward the interface again. "You archived the old program," he said. "You know what happened?" Rowan exhaled slowly. "It wasn't supposed to fail," he said. "That's the problem with thresholds," Callan replied. "They don't warn you before they're crossed." Argus walked slowly around Rowan, not threatening, but observant. His nose hovered near Rowan's boots briefly before moving on. Rowan looked down at the dog. "He doesn't like this place," Rowan said softly. "He doesn't like imbalance," Callan answered. Rowan's shoulders sagged slightly. "You think I'm repeating history," he said. Callan met his gaze. "I think you're closer than you realize." The vibration unit emitted a steady pulse. Calmer now. Rowan studied the data again, fingers hovering uncertainly above the tablet screen. "What would you do?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was genuine. Callan considered the question carefully. "Lower amplitude," he said. "Increase observation period. Stop trying to outrun the data." Rowan hesitated. Then, slowly, he adjusted the system parameters. The hum softened, subtle, but real. Argus's posture relaxed a fraction. Callan noticed. Rowan noticed too. "You really think he can sense it?" Rowan asked quietly. "Yes," Callan said. "And he doesn't care about projections." Rowan let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. "For what it's worth," Rowan said, "I'm not your enemy." Callan nodded once. "I know." The difference between them was not morality. It was experience. They climbed out of the hatch together, sealing it behind them. Outside, the night had settled fully. Stars pierced the dark above the ridge. Rowan paused before leaving. "If there's something unstable in the model," he said, "I want to know before anyone gets hurt." Callan studied him for a long moment. "I believe you," he said. Rowan's relief was subtle but visible. He returned to his vehicle and drove off, headlights weaving between the trees until they vanished. Callan remained. Argus stood beside him. The relay station hummed faintly in the night, less aggressive now. Callan placed a hand on Argus's neck. The dog's heartbeat was steady. "Not the same mistake," Callan murmured. The forest answered with wind through pine needles. No tremor, no spike, just waiting. Callan turned toward the path leading down to the cabin. He was no longer just observing. He was inside the equation now. The morning after the adjustment, the forest felt deceptively normal. Sunlight filtered through the pines in fractured gold. The lake lay quiet. Birds resumed their territorial arguments as if nothing beneath the soil had been disturbed. But Callan had learned that absence of noise did not equal absence of pressure. He stood at the edge of the clearing outside his cabin, arms folded, eyes fixed toward the ridge. Argus stood beside him, posture alert, but no longer tense. The German shepherd's breathing was steady. His dark eyes moved across the tree line in measured sweeps, not hunting, not fearing, evaluating. Callan trusted that posture more than any instrument. Rowan had reduced amplitude. That meant one of two things. Either he was listening, or someone else wasn't. By mid-morning, a county cruiser rolled slowly down the narrow gravel road, leading toward the lake. It stopped short of the cabin, engine idling for a few seconds before cutting off. Argus's ears flicked once, but he did not move forward. The driver stepped out. Sheriff Nolan Keene was a man built from practical decisions. Early 50s, broad chest thickened by years of routine rather than vanity. His dark hair had thinned unevenly, and the lines at the corners of his mouth suggested he had spent more time mediating disputes than enforcing them. He wore his uniform like someone who understood it was both shield and weight. He removed his hat before approaching. "Morning," he called out. Callan nodded. Sheriff Keene's gaze lingered briefly on Argus. "That dog doesn't miss much, does he?" "No," Callan said. Keene studied Callan in return. "You've been up on the ridge." Not a question. "Yes." Keene sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I had a feeling." He walked closer but stopped at a respectful distance. "The company funding that project has brought more money into this county than we've seen in 15 years, Keene said. "Road repairs, school upgrades, emergency services equipment." "And what are they extracting in return?" Callan asked. Keene didn't flinch. "Data," he said. "Mapping, soil density, ground stability, nothing illegal." Callan watched the sheriff's face carefully. Keene wasn't a corrupt man. He carried fatigue in his eyes, the kind earned from years of choosing the least damaging option rather than the right one. "You believe that?" Callan asked. Keene hesitated. "I believe," he said slowly, "that if I shut them down without proof, this town pays the price." Argus shifted slightly, stepping between Callan and the sheriff, not aggressively, simply positioning himself as a boundary. Keene noticed. "Easy," he said softly. "I'm not your enemy." Callan almost smiled. "Seems like nobody is," he said. "And that's the problem." Keene exhaled sharply through his nose. "You've got a history," the sheriff added. "Military, special operations." Callan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't dig into records unless I have to," Keene continued. "But if this turns into something that threatens the town, I need to know who I'm dealing with." "You're dealing with someone who's seen this before," Callan said. Keene's eyes sharpened. "Then tell me what you think is happening." Callan hesitated, not because he lacked words, because he understood consequences. "They're pushing amplitude thresholds," he said finally. "Testing resonance at limits that don't show damage immediately." Keene folded his arms. And limits don't announce themselves when they break." The sheriff absorbed that in silence. "Get me proof," he said at last. "Something concrete, not instinct." He tipped his hat and returned to his cruiser. Argus watched until the vehicle disappeared down the gravel road. Callan spent the afternoon reviewing what he'd copied from the system logs the previous night. He had accessed enough to understand the structure of the data. enough to know what was missing. There were gaps, selective redactions, whole amplitude sequences removed from summary reports. Rowan had access to operational data, but not executive oversight. Callan recognized the pattern. In the desert, the field team had never seen the full modeling projections either. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the laptop screen. If someone above Rowan was overriding safety thresholds, they would not leave fingerprints in obvious places. They would hide them in timing, in cycles, in scheduled escalations that appeared gradual, but compounded risk over weeks. Argus rose suddenly, not sharply, not alarmed, but deliberate. He moved to the front door and sat. Callan glanced at the clock. 3:17 p.m. The test cycles had shifted. Earlier that morning, the pattern had been midday neutral. Now the dog's behavior suggested otherwise. Callan stepped outside. The air felt heavier, not visibly altered, but perceptibly weighted. He closed his eyes and focused. There it was again. A faint, distant pressure, not from the ridge directly, but from beneath. He checked the vibration meter. Numbers were climbing, not dramatically, but consistently, higher than Rowan's reduced settings would suggest. Callan's expression hardened. Either Rowan had changed parameters again, or someone else had. Argus walked past Callan and placed himself at the base of a large pine tree near the lake. He did not stare toward the ridge this time. He stared down. His paws shifted slightly in the soil, as if testing tension beneath it. Then he lifted his head and looked directly at Callan, not for instruction, for acknowledgement. In that silent exchange, Callan understood something unsettling. The resonance was no longer isolated to the relay station. It was propagating through the natural root systems, traveling along interconnected substrates. The forest itself had become a conductor. The realization did not frighten him. It clarified the stakes. By early evening, Callan was back on the ridge. This time he did not approach stealthily. He walked straight to the door and entered without knocking. Rowan was already inside, staring at a diagnostic panel. His posture was different, tense, defensive. "You adjusted amplitude," Callan said. Rowan shook his head immediately. "I didn't," he replied. "I've been in remote sync mode all afternoon." Callan stepped closer. The interface confirmed it. The system had initiated an automated calibration override. "Who has remote authority?" Callan asked. Rowan's jaw tightened. "Corporate oversight," he admitted. "Names?" Rowan hesitated. "Dr. Miriam Halverson," he said finally. Callan waited. "She's head of advanced geological modeling," Rowan continued. "Mid-50s, Norwegian background, brilliant, ruthless about data integrity." Rowan looked at Callan carefully. "She believes predictive modeling can prevent catastrophes before they occur. Her own father died in a landslide when she was 17. She built her career around eliminating uncertainty. And she eliminates it by pushing risk," Callan said. Rowan's silence confirmed the possibility. The system pulsed again, stronger. Rowan's face drained slightly of color. "That's not my calibration curve," he whispered. Callan stepped to the main console. "You need to shut it down." Rowan hesitated. "If I override executive command without justification—" "You won't have a town to justify it to," Callan interrupted. Argus moved toward the ladder entrance. He stood there, watching the ceiling as if sensing strain in the air itself. Rowan's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "You're asking me to violate protocol," he said. "I'm asking you to prevent escalation," Callan replied. The two men locked eyes. Callan saw himself 20 years ago reflected there. The belief that systems corrected themselves. They didn't. People did. Rowan inhaled sharply and entered a manual override sequence. The console resisted, authorization prompts flashing red. Rowan entered his credentials again, then a secondary override. The hum shifted, lower, slower. The spike flattened. The room exhaled. Argus's posture eased. Rowan leaned back, breathing heavily. "They're going to see that," he said. "Yes," Callan replied. Rowan looked at him. "Then I'll need more than instinct." Callan nodded. "You'll get data." Outside, the forest remained standing. But something fundamental had changed. This was no longer a field trial drifting beyond its margins. It was a system being driven from above. Callan stepped toward the exit. "You wanted to save lives," he said to Rowan. "Now you have to decide whose." Rowan didn't answer. He stared at the screen, at the amplitude graph slowly stabilizing. Argus waited at the doorway. When Callan stepped into the evening air, the sky was streaked in deep orange and violet. The trees swayed gently, not from tremor, but from wind, for now. Callan knew the line had been crossed, not in the earth, but in allegiance. Rowan had chosen to override authority once. The next choice would be harder. Callan walked back down the ridge with Argus beside him. The forest hummed softly, not from machinery, but from life. He intended to keep it that way. The escalation did not announce itself. It unfolded gradually over 3 days. Small increments in amplitude, hidden within routine calibration reports. Rowan sent Callan copies of the logs quietly, without commentary. The numbers were precise, clinical, detached. The earth, however, was not. Callan felt it first beneath his cabin floorboards. Not a tremor this time, but a subtle shifting of resonance, like tension pulled taut and left unresolved. The well pump began cycling more frequently. The lake level dropped by a fraction of an inch over 24 hours, barely perceptible unless you knew where to look. He knew where to look. Argus knew before him. The dog began circling the perimeter of the cabin at irregular intervals, nose low, tail neither raised nor tucked. Simply attentive. His movements were methodical. He paused longer at the western edge of the clearing, where the soil dipped toward an underground aquifer feeding the lake. Callan knelt there one afternoon, pressing, his palm flat against the ground. It felt warm, not from sunlight, from friction. He exhaled slowly. "They're increasing output," he said. Argus's ears twitched. Rowan arrived at dusk without calling ahead. His usual composed posture had frayed at the edges. His glasses were slightly askew, hair pushed back by nervous hands. He carried a tablet under one arm, fingers tapping against its surface in restless intervals. "They've moved the cycle schedule," he said without preamble. "Corporate wants accelerated data sets." Callan studied him. "You told them about the instability?" Rowan's jaw tightened. "I told them about anomaly drift. They told me to quantify it. And I can't yet." Callan stepped aside, gesturing toward the porch. Rowan sat heavily in one of the wooden chairs. He looked younger than his 34 years in that moment. Not naive, but burdened. "You need to understand something," Rowan said quietly. "Dr. Halverson believes in eliminating catastrophe through prediction. She thinks if we can model failure precisely, we prevent it." "And if the model itself introduces failure?" Callan asked. Rowan didn't answer. Argus lay near the porch steps, head resting on his paws, but eyes open, tracking every shift in tone between the two men. The vibration meter on the table flickered faintly. Callan glanced at it. "Cycle's starting early," he said. Rowan stiffened. That's not possible. But the meter continued to climb. They didn't speak again until they reached the ridge. Inside the underground chamber, the system was already in active emission. The interface glowed brighter than usual. Radial graphs pulsed outward in rapid succession, mapping subterranean layers in tight frequency bands. Rowan moved quickly to the control console. "They bypassed my last adjustment," he said. "They've increased upper threshold." Callan felt the weight of the room differently now. Not only pressure, but urgency. He stepped closer to the central unit. "Your model predicts what happens if resonance interacts with groundwater?" he asked. Rowan hesitated. "Not fully," he admitted. "We're collecting data to refine it." Callan's gaze hardened. "My cabin sits on that aquifer." Rowan swallowed. "That's not in the primary risk zone." "Risk zones move," Callan replied. The amplitude indicator rose another notch. Rowan's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "I can trigger a controlled overload," Callan said quietly. "Force a shutdown." Rowan turned sharply. That could destabilize the entire local grid. It would end this. "And create a different disaster," Rowan shot back. Callan looked at the hatch ceiling. For a moment, he imagined desert sand instead of pine forest. Heat instead of damp earth. The voice of a younger engineer arguing for caution while others pushed for results. The anger returned. Not at Rowan, but at himself. He moved to the manual override panel. The command sequence for emergency overload blinked on screen, red and unmistakable. Rowan stepped closer. "If you do that," he said, voice low, "you collapse pressure gradients abruptly. Groundwater displacement could sink half the shoreline." Callan knew that. He also knew delay could allow deeper resonance fractures to propagate unseen. Argus rose slowly from his resting position near the ladder. He walked toward Callan, not hurried, not anxious. He stopped inches from him. Callan's finger hovered above the activation key, his pulse steadied. The room hummed with increasing intensity. Argus stepped forward. He did not growl, he did not bark. He lifted one paw and placed it gently against Callan's wrist. Not forcefully, not pleading, steady. Callan's breath caught. For a split second, the underground chamber dissolved into memory. The moment years ago when he had trusted authority over instinct, action over responsibility. The weight of a decision pressed down on him then as it did now. Argus's paw remained in place, not moving, not shaking. Callan closed his eyes. He lowered his hand. "I won't repeat it," he murmured. Rowan exhaled slowly. "What are you doing?" Rowan asked. "Lower amplitude gradually," Callan said. "Not through force, through constraint." Rowan hesitated only a moment before nodding. They worked side by side at the console, one adjusting input curves, the other monitoring groundwater displacement models in real time. The hum softened incrementally. Graphs stabilized. The overload option dimmed back to neutral. Argus removed his paw and stepped back. He didn't celebrate. He simply watched. Just as the system began to level, a secondary screen lit up unprompted. Neither man touched it. An incoming remote transmission flashed across the display. Rowan froze. The interface auto-opened to a video feed. Dr. Miriam Halverson appeared on screen. She was exactly as Rowan had described. Mid-50s, sharp features carved by intellect rather than age. Silver blonde hair pulled tightly into a low knot. Her eyes were pale blue, analytical, unblinking. She wore a dark tailored jacket over a minimalist blouse, posture straight even through digital compression. Her voice was calm. "Rowan," she said, "why are you manually suppressing data escalation?" Rowan's throat tightened. Callan stepped into view without speaking. Halverson's gaze shifted toward him. There was no surprise in her expression, only evaluation. "You must be Mr. Rhodes," she said evenly. The hum of the system continued in the background. "Your interference is noted," she added. The transmission ended abruptly. The screen returned to diagnostic mode. Rowan stared at the blank interface. "She knows," he whispered. Callan's face remained unreadable. "Yes," he said. "Now she does." They climbed out of the hatch together. The night air felt colder than before, though the sky remained clear. Rowan ran a hand through his hair. "She won't stop," he said quietly. "Not without definitive evidence." "Then we gather it," Callan replied. Rowan looked at him carefully. "You're not trying to destroy this." "No," Callan said. "I'm trying to prevent you from becoming what I was." Rowan absorbed that in silence. Argus stood between them, gaze alternating from one to the other. Not anxious, resolute. Callan turned toward the path descending to the lake. Rowan remained behind for a moment, staring at the relay station as if seeing it for the first time. Not as a solution, but as a question. When Callan reached the clearing near his cabin, he paused. The ground felt stable beneath his boots. The lake shimmered under moonlight. For now. He knelt and ran his hand along Argus's neck. "You were right," he said quietly. Argus leaned into him briefly. The threshold had been approached. It had not been crossed. Not tonight. Callan rose slowly. The decision had not destroyed the system. It had restrained it. And sometimes restraint was the greater act of strength. The escalation did not come with warning. It arrived with precision. At 2:14 a.m., Callan's vibration meter on the kitchen counter began flashing red. He had fallen asleep in the chair beside the window, boots still on, the laptop screen dimmed but active. Argus was already standing before the first audible shift occurred. The dog didn't bark. He turned his head toward the ridge and stiffened. Callan was awake before the second pulse. The sensation this time wasn't subtle. It wasn't background pressure. It was structured force, layered resonance striking bedrock in rapid succession. He grabbed the meter, amplitude climbing fast, too fast. Rowan hadn't sent any update. Callan stepped outside. The forest felt wrong, not trembling violently, but vibrating in a way that felt unnatural, like tension in an overstretched wire. Argus moved toward the tree line immediately. No hesitation. Callan followed. By the time they reached the relay station, the door was ajar. Lights glowed beneath the hatch. The hum below was aggressive now, deep, oscillating, a mechanical heartbeat amplified. Callan descended quickly. The underground chamber was in active peak emission mode. Rowan stood at the main console, hands moving frantically across controls that were no longer responding. His glasses had slipped down his nose. His hair was disheveled, face pale under the fluorescent lighting. "They triggered full-cycle resonance remotely," he said without turning. "Halverson overrode every safety governor." The interface screen displayed cascading amplitude curves, higher than any previous run. "You need to shut it down," Callan said. "I'm trying," Rowan snapped. "It's locked behind executive encryption." The floor beneath them vibrated harder. Dust fell from the ceiling seams. Callan's mind split into cold compartments, options. He moved to the auxiliary server rack. A data port blinked steadily. Live transmission to corporate headquarters. He could copy everything. Right now, the evidence, proof of override, proof of negligence. The laptop in his pack could pull it within minutes. But the amplitude indicator climbed again. Rowan slammed his palm against the keyboard. "It's not stabilizing," he whispered. The central emission unit's casing began emitting heat distortion waves. Callan calculated instinctively. Time to catastrophic fracture. Minutes, not hours. He pulled the laptop from his bag and connected it to the port. Data began transferring. Fast. Rowan glanced over his shoulder. "You're copying it?" he asked, voice strained. "Yes." The ground lurched. Not collapse, but warning. Rowan stumbled sideways, hitting the server rack. A panel above the main control console sparked. Emergency lighting flickered. Callan looked at the progress bar. 38%. Argus suddenly moved. He did not circle. He did not hesitate. He ran toward Rowan. The floor beneath the emission unit cracked, not splitting, but fissuring along a seam. Rowan lost balance and fell hard against the base of the central unit. A support bracket dislodged. A metal beam dropped halfway, pinning his leg. He screamed, not in panic, but in pain. Callan froze for half a second. The progress bar climbed. 52%. He could finish the transfer. He could secure everything. And then act. Or he could move. Rowan struggled, trying to free himself, but the vibration intensified. The overhead lighting burst, plunging half the chamber into darkness. The central unit screamed, a high, metallic whine undercutting the lower hum. Callan made his choice. He disconnected the laptop. Data transfer incomplete. He ran. Argus reached Rowan first. The dog didn't bark. He wedged his body between Rowan and the emission unit, bracing himself against the unstable floor. His paws slid but held. Callan dropped to one knee beside Rowan and gripped the fallen beam. "Can you move your foot?" he shouted. Rowan's face was clenched in agony. "No." Z's vibration increased again. Callan remembered the desert. Dust filling lungs, someone screaming under debris, the command voice in his ear telling him to hold position. He ignored memory. He lifted. The beam resisted. Argus shifted position, pressing his shoulder into the metal, adding leverage with instinctive precision. The beam rose just enough. Rowan dragged his leg free, collapsing forward. Callan pulled him away from the central unit as the emission casing split along one seam, releasing a plume of heated air. They hit the far wall together. Argus retreated backward in short, controlled steps, eyes never leaving the unit. The amplitude indicator spiked one final time, then dropped. Rowan's earlier manual parameter restrictions must have limited maximum escalation. The system began auto-cooling. The hum diminished. Dust settled. Silence fell thick and heavy. In the settling quiet, something else became audible. Not machinery. A distant cracking sound from above. Callan's head snapped upward. The ceiling groaned faintly. For a split second, he imagined the entire ridge collapsing in on them. But the sound did not intensify. It faded. Argus lifted his head slowly, listening, not alarmed, assessing. The earth had responded, but it had not broken, and that difference would matter. Callan helped Rowan sit upright. Rowan's leg trembled, but no bone protruded. "Can you stand?" Callan asked. Rowan nodded weakly. Argus approached cautiously, sniffed Rowan's pant leg near the ankle, then looked up at Callan. No fracture scent. Callan exhaled. They climbed the ladder together. Outside, the forest was eerily still. No birds, no wind. The air felt stunned. Callan guided Rowan to the ground near the tree line. "You need medical evaluation," he said. Rowan shook his head. "I'll live." Callan looked back at the relay station. Smoke drifted faintly from a vent seam. He turned to Rowan. "This is what peak looks like," he said. Rowan swallowed. "She pushed it beyond model confidence intervals," he whispered. Yes. Rowan stared at his hands. I believe the model would constrain risk, he said quietly. I thought parameters meant protection. Callan sat beside him. Models describe behavior, he said. They don't control it. Argus settled beside them, head high, watching the ridge. Rowan's voice lowered. She knew we'd object, he said. That's why she executed the override at night. Callan nodded once. You still have access? He asked. Rowan hesitated. Yes. Then we finished the transfer. They descended again, carefully this time. The chamber was stable, though scarred. Callan reconnected the laptop. Data transfer resumed. Full log sequences, override commands, executive encryption signatures. 100%. He closed the lid slowly. Rowan leaned against the wall. I'll testify, he said. Callan studied him. You understand what that means? Rowan nodded. It means I was wrong, he said, and that someone higher decided numbers mattered more than people. Argus stepped forward and nudged Rowan's hand gently. Rowan looked down at the dog. You came back for me, he murmured. Argus blinked once. Not pride, not relief, just presence. Callan rose. We don't destroy it, he said. We expose it. Rowan nodded. No more escalation, he said. They sealed the hatch. Outside, dawn was breaking faintly along the horizon. Callan looked toward the lake in the distance. No visible collapse. No shoreline sink, for now. He placed a hand on Argus's back. 20 years ago, someone had been left beneath unstable ground. Tonight, no one was. That was the difference, and it would be enough. The story did not explode. It unfolded. Within 48 hours of Rowan submitting the encrypted data archive to a federal oversight committee and forwarding copies anonymously to 2 investigative journalists, the narrative shifted beyond the forest. Headlines did not scream catastrophe. They whispered liability. Internal override logs, executive authorization, safety thresholds bypassed. The corporation responded with a brief statement about misinterpretation of adaptive field trials. But investors reacted faster than press conferences. Stock value dipped. Regulators began inquiries. Equipment shipments halted. By the end of the week, trucks arrived quietly at the ridge. They didn't look like military. They looked like contractors. Gray uniforms, reflective stripes, measured efficiency. Solar panels were dismantled first. Transmission arrays removed second. Server cores extracted last. The relay station returned to silence, without ceremony. Sheriff Nolan Keene stood at the edge of the clearing. The morning dismantling began. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered but thickened slightly by years of desk work. His dark hair had grayed at the temples, and he kept a trimmed mustache that gave him an old-school lawman appearance. His brown eyes carried the fatigue of someone who'd spent years balancing loyalty to community with pressure from funding sources. He watched the trucks load equipment in silence. Callan approached from the tree line. Argus walked at his side, slower than before but steady. Sheriff Keene looked at Callan for a long moment. You could have made this ugly, Keene said. Callan shrugged slightly. It already was. Keene nodded once. The council voted unanimously, he said. We're severing financial partnership with the corporation. That wasn't an easy decision. The corporation had funded road repairs, sponsored school equipment, paid for seasonal wildfire mitigation crews. Keene had defended them publicly more than once. You did the right thing, Callan said. Keene exhaled. I did the necessary thing, he replied. There's a difference. He glanced down at Argus. Dog looks tired, he added quietly. He is, Callan said. Keene nodded and walked back toward his cruiser. No handshake, no ceremony, just acknowledgement. The forest felt different in the days that followed. Not brighter, just lighter. The vibration meter on Callan's kitchen counter remained dark. The well pump cycled normally. The lake reflected sky without distortion. Rowan left town 3 days after the shutdown. He stopped by the cabin before departing. His leg had healed enough to walk without a brace, though he still moved carefully on uneven ground. He looked thinner, less burdened perhaps, or simply more aware. "They offered me a settlement," he said quietly, "in exchange for silence." Callan leaned against the porch railing. "And?" "I declined." Rowan's expression held no arrogance, just certainty. "I'm transferring to a public research institute," he added. "Transparent funding." Callan nodded. "That matters." Rowan looked toward the ridge. "I thought progress was neutral," he said. "That data itself was harmless." Callan didn't answer immediately. "Tools aren't neutral," he said finally. "People are." Rowan absorbed that. Argus approached him slowly and rested his muzzle briefly against Rowan's thigh. A silent goodbye. Rowan smiled faintly. "I won't forget that," he said softly. He left before noon. The media cycle lasted 3 weeks. Then it moved on. Callan's name, however, did not. His military record surfaced in background research. Articles framed him alternately as whistleblower veteran and former classified operations asset. An old deployment report was reopened by a defense subcommittee seeking historical context on geological field testing programs. Callan received 2 formal letters requesting testimony. He sat at the kitchen table holding them long after sunset. Argus lay beneath the table, breathing slow and deep. "You can't disappear anymore," Callan said quietly. Argus opened one eye briefly, then closed it again. Callan ran a hand through his beard. 20 years ago, he had obeyed orders and buried doubt. Now the doubt had returned with paperwork attached. He didn't fear investigation. He feared reopening memory. But hiding had never truly worked. The following week, he confirmed attendance. One afternoon, while Callan sat on the porch reading through old mission transcripts he had not touched in 2 decades, Argus stood abruptly. No ridge, no machinery, no measurable vibration. He faced the forest beyond the lake and stared into the trees. Callan watched him carefully. Argus's ears lifted slightly, but not in alarm, recognition. Callan followed his gaze. There was nothing visible, no movement, no sound, just pine trunks layered in light. Argus relaxed slowly after several seconds. He lay back down. Callan felt something settle inside him. The dog wasn't reacting to danger. He was acknowledging absence. The forest no longer carried hidden pressure. The silence was clean. And for the first time since arriving, Callan allowed himself to believe it. Summer edged toward late August. Argus's pace changed gradually. It wasn't sudden decline, just subtle adjustment. His morning patrols shortened. He lay down more frequently in patches of sunlight. His once effortless leap onto the porch required a pause beforehand. The silver in his muzzle spread. Callan noticed every detail. He adjusted too. Walks became slower. Routes shortened. Water breaks increased. At night, Argus chose to sleep outside more often. Front paws stretched forward, chin resting atop them, eyes half open as if listening to something distant and private. Callan joined him on the porch floor one evening. No chair, just wood beneath him. "You remember the desert?" Callan asked quietly. Argus's ear twitched. "I thought strength meant control," Callan continued. "That following orders meant integrity." The wind moved through the pines in steady rhythm. "I was wrong." Argus shifted slightly closer. Callan rested a hand against his side, feeling the slow rise and fall of breath. The cabin stood behind them, unchanged, upright. No fractures in the foundation, no sinkholes near the shoreline. The ridge in the distance looked smaller somehow, without equipment perched upon it. Sheriff Keene had stopped by earlier that week, not officially. He'd brought a folder with printed statements from town residents, notes of gratitude. Not dramatic, simple acknowledgments. "Your dog saved more than one person," Keene had said. Callan hadn't argued. Argus hadn't reacted. The dog did not understand press cycles or legal hearings. He understood tension and release. Callan testified in Washington in early September. He spoke, calmly, without embellishment. He described the original desert program, the decision chain, the collapse. He did not accuse individuals by name. He described consequences. Afterward, a junior staffer, a woman in her 20s with dark braided hair and tired but earnest eyes, thanked him quietly. "My brother serves," she said. "It matters when someone admits a mistake." Callan nodded. It wasn't absolution, but it was acknowledgement. He returned to Minnesota 2 days later. Argus greeted him at the edge of the clearing, walking slowly but determined. Callan knelt. "I'm back," he said softly. Argus pressed his forehead briefly against Callan's chest. Autumn began turning the treetops gold. One evening, under a sky streaked with amber light, Argus lay at the edge of the porch, facing the forest. Callan sat beside him. No vibration meter on the table, no letters unopened, no trucks on the ridge, just wind through pine. Argus's breathing was slower now, measured, peaceful. Callan looked toward the forest and then back at the dog. 20 years ago, he said quietly. I didn't listen. He placed his hand gently against Argus's shoulder. This time, I did. Argus did not move. The forest carried no hidden hum, only wind. Callan did not feel stronger than he had been 2 decades earlier. He felt clearer, and clarity, he realized, was its own kind of strength. The cabin remained standing, so did he. And beside him, the dog who had taught him the difference between obedience and responsibility rested in silence, no longer guarding against unseen danger, but simply listening to the world as it was. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as fire from the sky or voices in the dark. Sometimes they arrive as a quiet warning in the chest, as a loyal dog who refuses to move, as a second chance placed gently in our hands. Callan thought strength meant following orders. He learned that true strength meant listening, to conscience, to instinct, to the still small voice God places inside every one of us. Argus did not perform a miracle. He simply stayed faithful. And perhaps that is what miracles really are, faithfulness at the right moment. In our daily lives, we may never face collapsing ground or secret systems beneath a forest, but we face smaller tremors every day, moments when we must choose between convenience and courage, silence and truth, fear and responsibility. God does not always shout. Sometimes he whispers, through intuition, through a child's question, through a loyal companion, through a second chance. If this story touched you, let it be a reminder. Listen when your heart warns you. Stand up when truth asks something of you. Protect what is entrusted to you. And never ignore the quiet guidance meant to save you. If this message meant something to you, share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment about a moment in your life when you felt guided or protected. Subscribe to the channel so more stories of courage, faith, and redemption can reach those who need them. May God bless you. Protect your home, steady your steps, and give you clarity when the ground beneath you feels uncertain. And may you always have the courage to listen.